So what we're going to do in this video is cover some basic trigonometric concepts. For many of you, this will be review. If not, it's not a problem. Trigonometry allows us to calculate the relationships between the sides of a triangle. The triangles that we'll mostly deal with are right triangles, that is a 90-degree angle between two of the sides. If you haven't had this before, it's fine. We'll be doing it about 3 trillion times over this course. I like to call my angle not usually theta, phi, which is another Greek letter. We have 3 sides. The side which is opposite to the angle, we'll call the opposite. Similarly, this side over here is right next to or adjacent to the angle, so it's the adjacent. And this long side, as you know, is the hypotenuse. So let's take the first ratio, the first definition here, and we're going to take the opposite side and divide by the hypotenuse. So the ratio of the opposite to the hypotenuse is called the sine of the angle. So that's the sine phi will be opposite over hypotenuse. Similarly, if we take the ratio of the adjacent to the hypotenuse, that's the cosine. And if we take the ratio of the opposite to the adjacent, that is not working, okay, abracadabra, that is the tangent. So the tangent is the opposite of the adjacent. Now, if you were to take just the sine of phi over the cosine of phi, so that becomes the opposite over the hypotenuse over the adjacent over the hypotenuse. Flip and multiply, so you get opposite over hypotenuse times hypotenuse over adjacent. And notice that these cancel out. So the tangent, which is the opposite over the adjacent, is also the sine over the cosine. What we're going to do now is to develop your first physics reflex. You know how when you go to the doctor and the doctor slams your knee with that little hammer and your knee and your leg shoots up? Well, that's a reflex. You don't have really a choice about it. It's just something that you naturally do. So too, we're going to have some physics reflexes, which are habits that we get into that we just do them without even thinking about it. So the first physics reflex has to do with finding the opposite side. If I take the sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse. Now, algebra says that whatever I do to one side, I can do to the other side, so I'm just going to multiply by the hypotenuse. Notice that this cancels. And so if I want the opposite side, it's going to be equal to the hypotenuse times the sine of the angle. And boom, this is going to be our first physics reflex. Secondly, if we take the adjacent side over the hypotenuse, well, that is the cosine. Once again, whatever we do to one side, we can do to the other side. Notice what we've got. The adjacent side is going to be equal to the hypotenuse times the cosine of the angle. So, physics reflexes. I want you to memorize these two relationships. Whenever you want the opposite side, hypotenuse sine of the angle. Whenever you want the adjacent side, hypotenuse cosine of the angle. Try some examples here. Here's our angle, 35 degrees. And let's say that I want to calculate side y. Notice that we have a right triangle here. So if I want side y, rather than to take the 2 steps and say, well, sine is y over 54 and then do the algebra, in one step, in one physics reflex, let's do it. So y is going to be equal to the hypotenuse, 54. It's opposite to the angle, so it's going to be sine 35. Let's throw in a unit there. 54 sine 35 meters. And that's going to be equal to 31.0 meters. Similarly, the x here is adjacent to this angle, so that's going to be hypotenuse 54 times the cosine of 35 degrees, and that's equal to 44.2 meters. Don't get into the habit of thinking that the vertical side is always the opposite or the horizontal side is always the adjacent. Here, the vertical side is right next to or adjacent to the angle. So physics reflex, we're going to take the hypotenuse, which is 94, times the cosine of the angle, which is cosine 50 degrees. And we should put some units there. And that's going to be equal to 60.4 meters. Similarly over here, the horizontal side, x now, is the opposite. So we'll go hypotenuse 94 sine of 50 degrees, and that's going to be equal to 72 meters. Supposing instead that you know the sides of the right triangle and you want to figure out what the angle is. Well, you could do it by knowing the sine, the cosine, or the tangent. In this case, the sine is going to be equal to 50 meters over 100 meters. Notice that the units meters cancel, and we get 0.5. The cosine would have been the adjacent 86.6 meters over the hypotenuse, 100 meters. Again, they cancel, and we get 0.867 if you really want to round, but 0.866. And the tangent of phi is going to be equal to 50 meters over 86.6 meters. And that is going to be equal to 0.58. So we have three different ways that we could figure out what this angle phi is. If you know what the sine is, then you can say, let me undo that, and I will take the inverse function of the sine, called the arc sine. Look at this notation. I know it says sine minus 1. That means arc sine. It's not 1 over the sine. If we wanted 1 over the sine, we would have had to have said the sine of phi to the minus 1 power. But that's not what we have in this case. We have the arc sine of 0.5, which means give me the value of the sine and I'll tell you the angle. That's going to be 30 degrees. Here we have the arc cosine, which says give me the cosine of the angle and I will tell you what it is, 30 degrees. Or give me the tangent of the angle and I will tell you what it is, and that's going to be equal to, again, 30 degrees.